Last time on Everdark, Daemon got a chance to strut his stuff, though he seemed mostly amused by the vampire's reactions to his nakedness. He also learned more of the terrible things that had happened during his long sleep. When we joined Fiona Darksilver as she spied upon him, realizing at the last moment that Daemon really is the Vampire King. Everdark, Episode 25. Fine. Julian awoke feeling luxuriously lazy. His naked limbs were lax beneath the soft-as-a-cloud comforter. The mattress beneath him cradled his body. He stretched his arms over his head and pointed his toes. There were no aches or pains, just comfort. He drew an arm down the bed beside him, looking for something, or really looking for someone. The mattress was cool. No one had lain there for some time. Daemon was not there. Julian felt a subtle flutter of panic, but nothing major, because he felt the immortal in his head at that moment. Daemon was nearby. He was meditating. Communing was the word that was sent through their bond. Julian didn't bother him further. He could sense that Daemon was busy with this very important task. Everything was fine. The flutter went away as if it had never been. But Julian wondered at it a little. He had never been afraid to be alone. Though he and Christian were inseparable, they didn't crowd one another. When they were researching, for example, they could be in different parts of Wingate, his parents' home, and not see one another for hours. He was never panicky about it. But Daemon not being there was unnerving. Julian opened his eyelids and looked around him. The room should have been perfectly dark. There were no windows or lights on, but he could still see. It wasn't seeing in the usual sense. It reminded him more of when they used their night vision cameras and there was a slight greenish tinge to everything. That's what he saw now, but quite a bit clearer. He sat up. The comforter tumbled down into his lap and lay there like a fallen cloud. He rubbed his face with one hand and it came back gritty. There was something on his chin and lips. He should clean himself up and go find Christian. With that in mind, Julian slid out of bed. He pulled on a pair of silk pants he found on the bench at the end of the bed that must have been left by one of the acolytes and padded towards where he remembered the bathroom being. He could actually smell the bath products, citrus and amber and rosemary, wafting out of the open doorway. He didn't turn on any lights until he stepped onto the cool tiled floor of the bathroom. He then looked at himself in the mirror.
Blood.
He stumbled back, not stopping until he hit the far bathroom wall and cold marble sucked all the warmth from his skin. His face, chin, throat, and chest were smeared with dried blood. His lips and teeth were stained with it. Julian began to hyperventilate. He slowly reached one hand up to lightly touch his chin, but his fingers sprang away as if they had minds of their own. He knew that this was simply the blood from last night's feeding frenzy. At the time, it had been amazing. He'd felt almost high from it. Not just almost, but definitely high, trippy, drugged out. But even before the blood exchange had gone on, before he'd lost himself in the ecstasy of the feeding, he'd known that he was going to drink blood. But somehow, seeing the evidence of it all over his face and neck and chest was different.
I'm a vampire,
he thought.
I'm really a vampire. I must drink human blood to survive.
He both wanted and didn't want Daemon there at that moment. He kept his emotions and thoughts tightly inside his own mind. He wasn't sure how the immortal would react to him freaking out about drinking blood. After all, that's what vampires did. That's how they lived. That's how they survived. And it was pleasurable. More than pleasurable.
But it's reminding me now of what I thought about vampires before. That they're monsters. That I'm a monster.
He closed his eyes for long moments. Daemon had fed from multiple people the night before. Even through the haze, he remembered those people being fine afterward. They had enjoyed being drunk from. The pleasure on their faces had surprised and pleased him. After the feeding, they had been carried out, still alive and utterly well. Daemon had not killed them. Julian had not been a part of murder or death. But it was still this knowledge that he was doing something that he would have considered disgusting just a few days ago that was rather shattering. He had gone with the flow, not really thinking too deeply about what he was doing. Maybe that was best, to just drift on the currents, because otherwise he would have to admit that he had become the very thing that had killed his parents. His eyelids flew open. Who had killed his parents? Balthazar? Someone in this house? Or maybe another vampire he'd yet to even hear of? Was he just going to let their deaths go because he was now the same as the creature that had taken their lives? He studied his red lips and pale skin beside it. He had never been very cognizant of his looks. He knew some people found him attractive, but when he looked into the mirror now, he was more than that. His skin had this luminosity that it hadn't before. He stifled the urge to issue a snort of laughter. He did sort of sparkle, but the blood that covered the lower half of his face did not look romantic or sexy. He looked inhuman. He heard a knock on the door, and Arcius's voice calling out,
"Julian."
Julian opened his mouth to answer, but he couldn't. The words seemed frozen in his throat. Then the horror at the thought that Arcius would see him like this, covered in blood and...
"Julian?"
He shut the bathroom door with vampire quickness just as Arcius stuck his head into the main room.
"Julian, are you all right?"
I'm...
Julian shuddered. A full-body shudder. He rested his forearms on the door's surface. How could the man appear now? Just when he was having a breakdown? It was like Arcius knew.
"Julian."
Concern tinted Arcius's voice. He was much closer now, just outside the bathroom door. Julian could picture him, big, bearded face a few inches from the door, a concerned frown on his lips and a creased forehead. He had to say something to get the man to go away.
It's okay, Arcius. I'm just...
Julian went over to the sink and frantically turned on the faucet and tried to scrub the blood away. But there was so much of it. It didn't seem like he was making a dent.
Just washing up.
"Julian, it's all right."
Arcius's voice was so gentle, as if he knew what was happening. He clearly wasn't listening to what Julian was saying, but maybe how he was saying it. Who knew what harmonics a vampire like Arcius could hear in his voice?
"Please let me come in. I can help you."
Julian stared into his purple, sparkling purple with silver highlights, eyes, and hardly recognized himself. He didn't look human. With the pale skin, violet eyes, and blood-stained mouth, he looked like what he was. Vampire.
I'm gonna have to get some contacts. No one is gonna believe these are real.
He muffled a hysterical laugh with one hand. It ended up sounding a bit like a sob.
"Julian, I'm coming in now."
Arcius said firmly. He'd clearly heard the sob. Julian hadn't locked the door. But even if he had, that wouldn't have kept a vampire out, let alone one as powerful as Arcius. So he knew that the man was coming in. He stood, frozen at the sink as Arcius stepped inside. Arcius's gaze met Julian's in the mirror. Julian's eyes were wide, water dripped off his chin, red-tinted water pooled in the sink's bowl. Arcius picked up a towel, wet it under the tap, and started to tenderly clean Julian's face.
I'm sorry.
Julian breathed.
I don't know what's wrong with me.
Arcius looked into his eyes.
"Don't you?"
Julian reached up to his face again, but dropped his hand once more.
The blood. I'm a mess. I should shower.
He wanted to get under scalding hot water and scrub.
"And you will, after we talk a wee bit."
Arcius told him. He'd swabbed off Julian's face and his neck was next.
There's nothing to talk about. I'm fine,
Julian said, but his voice shook a little. He swallowed and firmed his lips. Arcius gave him a quirky smile.
"Why am I certain that you say this often? I bet that you've had to be fine for a lot of your life, haven't you?"
Julian turned his head, suddenly unable to meet Arcius's gaze any longer. His eyes burned with ridiculous tears, and he blinked them away.
Normally, I am fine, and I will be fine. There's just been a lot of changes over the last couple of days. I just saw the blood, and it all came flooding in. I don't know. Last night was amazing. I wanted what happened to happen. I don't know why I'm...
"Freaking out?"
Another smile, tender and understanding.
"Because nothing that has happened to you since this all began is normal."
Even for a vampire?
Julian gave him a jagged grin.
"Especially not for a vampire."
Arcius looked quite grave as he explained.
We prepare people for their second life with a great deal of care. They are tutored in vampire society, laws, customs. They undergo psychological testing and counselling.
Julian caught Arcius's wrist lightly, but much too fast for him to actually see.
Wait a minute. There are vampire psychiatrists?
Of course.
Arcius said so matter-of-factly that Julian was shocked into silence. But then he thought of Dr. Stone. The vampires probably chose people for their skills and aptitudes. It made sense to him.
These potential fledglings are welcomed into the night after they have come to see the act of feeding as solely beautiful.
It was beautiful,
Julian murmured, remembering how his and Daemon's bodies had just melded together as they'd exchanged blood. It felt like exchanging pieces of their souls. Other than Christian, he'd never felt so close to anyone. He wondered what it would be like to exchange blood with his best friend. His chest clenched at the thought, and he wasn't sure if it was in desire or disgust or a mixture of both. He rubbed his eyes.
If Christian saw me like this, he totally wouldn't be surprised.
How so?
Arcius asked as he continued to clean him, as if it were totally normal for two adult men to bathe one another and have it be nothing sexual. But the truth was that Julian just felt very safe with the vampire confessor. He sensed, no, he knew, that he was not in danger from this big bear of a man.
I'm always gung-ho about things, ready to try anything once, and for the most part, I don't regret it.
Julian gave him a wry smile.
But there are other times when I do something that's just a little bit more of a stretch for me. And when I come down from the experience, well, it's not exactly a regret. It's just that I don't feel like myself.
He caught sight of his face in the mirror again. No longer was he covered in flaking, dried crimson, but instead was clean and looked somehow pure, especially with his strange eyes. Arcius touched the skin beneath one of his eyes.
Beautiful,
Arcius murmured.
But they set me apart, even among vampires?
Julian guessed. The confessor nodded.
But I do not imagine that you ever cared to fit in.
No, I never have. But I have a feeling that this may make things more difficult for House Ravenscroft.
Last week, I urged anyone joining WraithRain.com as a member to explore my other gay serials. Today, I want to tell you about a completed werewolf romance story called Crimson. This was supposed to be a gay retelling of Little Red Riding Hood with werewolves. It didn't turn out that way, but it is a sweet and sexy tale of romance and found family. Here's the blurb. Gareth, alpha werewolf of the Cold Moon Pack, does not believe in mates. His friend went mad after his mate was killed, so Gareth resists love. But then he meets Jude Connor. Growing up an orphan, Jude experienced human cruelty and trusts no one. Still, he dreams of belonging to someone and being part of a family. Can he bring himself to trust Gareth and the Cold Moon Pack and make that dream a reality? Since this story is shorter at 47 chapters and not part of a larger story world, Crimson is a great place for new members to get started. If you do join us, I really hope you read this story and tell me what you think.
Arcius nodded again.
But it is something we must do. It is not something that we can shirk from. And I think, in the end, it will lead to good.
The bear-like vampire shook himself.
We've gone a wee bit off topic. We must talk about you and all of this.
I'm good now.
Julian held a hand out to show that he was steady as a rock. He only felt a little fragile, but he could hide that. Evidently, he was losing his touch at lying. Or Arcius was just a really good observer, as the confessor gave him a disbelieving look of furrowed brows and compressed lips.
You went from not even knowing we existed, or worse, believing we did but hating us, to suddenly being one of us, more than one of us, the fledgling of the first among equals.
Arcius pointed out.
And that's just the start of what happened to you, isn't it? You were attacked. You thought your best friend was going to die. You then experienced your first feeding last night, one of the most unusual ones that I've ever experienced, and you claim to be fine. Is that about right?
I think that just about sums it up.
Julian nodded and let out an inappropriate laugh. Arcius's expression grew troubled.
And then you woke up alone.
This isn't Daemon's fault.
Julian found himself defending the immortal.
Fault? No. Not understanding what a fledgling needs? What a former human needs?
Arcius didn't answer these questions out loud, but Julian could see the answers in his eyes.
He's communing or something. It's important.
And that is why I'm not bringing him in here this instant.
Arcius answered.
You would drag him in here by his ear?
Julian gave a disbelieving smile.
I thought you worship him or something.
He is our progenitor.
Arcius intoned as if this were a schoolroom.
He holds answers to questions we haven't even thought to ask about ourselves. He has lived countless ages. He has much wisdom to impart. And, from what I've seen of him, he is worthy of respect and worship. But that does not mean he is infallible.
He's not. I mean, he's great, but he's not perfect.
Julian looked down at his bare feet. His toes gripped the cool tile.
But I know that he wouldn't do anything to hurt me. We're figuring out this fledgling thing together. And I'm cool with what he's doing.
Julian felt like he was protesting too much on Daemon's behalf. He remembered that faint panic. He firmed his shoulders. He wasn't a child any longer. Daemon was not his parent. He could stand on his own 2 feet. He had gone to countless countries around the world, entered night-shrouded tombs, run from men with guns, climbed snow-chilled mountains, spelunked in forgotten caves, scuba-dived over 100 feet down, and so much more. He wasn't a wilting flower. How could he be so much stronger as a vampire, but feel weaker in this one thing, at least, than he had as a human?
And I'm guessing you're hiding from him these turbulent feelings you're experiencing.
Arcius looked rather stern.
I'm fine. Now.
Arcius gave out a long, suffering sigh. Somehow that made Julian feel warm inside. He imagined that Arcius made this sound often with those he cared for.
You're Daemon's first fledgling. Though he witnessed the other immortals creating their own, he would not know exactly what to do.
Arcius explained.
He is still new at this. He needs guidance.
And you're going to give it to him?
This had another genuine smile dawning on Julian's lips. He could well imagine the bear-like vampire, hands on hips, telling Daemon to go cuddle with his fledgling or else. It was a ridiculous image, one that would never happen, but it cheered him nonetheless.
I will give him my advice. I just took him to the garden and came back here to get him his coat. I think you should accompany me to see him.
Arcius told him as he finished off drying Julian's chest with another towel. Julian frowned even as his heart rate sped up a little at seeing Daemon.
He loves that coat, though. Really, he needs some modern-styled clothes. At least the fur is warm.
Yes, he's quite fond of it.
Arcius's tone was dry as he reminded Julian,
Vampires don't feel the cold as humans do, and I think that Daemon may feel it even less. He's out there, right now, naked.
It took Julian a few beats to understand what Arcius had said. His eyebrows crawled up into his hairline.
Naked? Outside in the garden?
Yes.
He just walked on out there with you to the garden totally naked?
Julian really had to understand things.
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed.
Vampires are probably beyond modesty and all that. I mean, right?
Julian asked. Yet at the same time, Julian had the ridiculous urge to stomp out into the garden with a very large blanket and wrap Daemon in it. He also had an equal urge to start laughing uproariously, as Arcius, on the one hand, didn't seem fazed, but on the other, seemed scandalized at the same time.
We are, though some are more modest than others.
Arcius paused, then added,
I think it is simply surprising because seeing Daemon unclothed is, well, worshipful.
That had Julian's eyebrows rising again. Then he admitted,
He's really hot. I mean, really.
He is perfection, and he is our progenitor, and the first among equals, and...
It's like royalty walking around nude in front of the subjects, right? Something like that?
Julian clarified.
In fact, royals did many things nude in front of their servants.
Julian held up a hand.
I don't want to know. Let's see what we can do about our particular royal and this nude thing.
Why don't you go brush your teeth and freshen up while I go get his robe?
Arcius suggested.
Sounds good.
He answered. Julian thought of the scalding shower he had wanted to take, but he didn't feel the need for it right at that moment. Maybe he'd take a shower with Daemon later. He was really fine now, or well on his way to it. Arcius had turned and was heading out the door when Julian called out to him.
Arcius?
The confessor turned with a raised eyebrow.
What?
Thank you.
Julian grimaced and rubbed a hand through his hair.
Thank you for checking on me and cleaning me up and talking and all of it.
There's no need for thanks. In a house, we support one another.
Arcius said with another kind smile.
Yeah, but Daemon and I aren't House Ravenscroft.
Julian hated saying that, but it was true. Arcius spoke carefully.
In a way, you're of every house and bloodline, Julian. Being Daemon's fledgling, you are connected to us all and should be welcomed by us all.
Thanks.
He looked down at his scrunched toes again. He wondered if anyone other than Arcius felt this, but at least the confessor did. Being close to Christian's house was utterly important to him. They were now in this literally forever.
That means a lot.
Arcius nodded and went out. Julian headed back to the vanity. There was a wrapped toothbrush and fresh toothpaste. His mouth was the last place where he could still see the pinkish stains. He opened his lips and looked inside. His fangs came out after a moment. It was so odd to see them elongate. They slid out of his gums easily before retracting again.
Okay, that's gonna take a little getting used to, but I can do it.
He brushed his teeth and washed his face again. He leaned on the vanity for another moment before leaving the bathroom. He had to appear like he was totally on top of his game. He didn't want to freak out anyone else, especially not Daemon or Christian. He didn't want his best friend trying to take care of him when Christian was undoubtedly going through similar experiences, or perhaps even worse. Christian didn't really like change at all. He didn't like things out of his control. Everything that had happened to them recently was a whole lot of change and little in their control. He simply didn't want to burden Christian. He pushed off the vanity and went into the living room where Arcius was waiting for him. Slung over one arm was Daemon's luxurious fur coat with the high collar. In his other hand, he had a pair of slip-on shoes and a shirt for Julian. Julian took them from him and put them on swiftly. If they were going to chastise Daemon for walking around in the buff, they had to be covered up. After he stuffed his feet into the shoes, the two of them swiftly left the coach house. He felt other vampires in the area, but they seemed to stay away from him. Maybe they thought that Daemon's fledgling would also walk around nude, and worried the Vampire King might take exception to them seeing him naked. Julian's mouth quirked into a half-hidden grin. When Arcius opened the door and the cool fall air wrapped around him, Julian realized that he really wasn't bothered by the cold. When he'd been in the derelict parking garage, he hadn't felt it either, but he was so out of sorts then that he hadn't been sure if this would last. Now he knew. Arcius took him to a small, isolated garden where he'd left Daemon. Julian's steps went faster as they got nearer the Vampire King. He could feel with every step that his master was near. He swallowed and stepped past some bushes only to come to a screeching halt. Arcius walked straight into him.
Julian, what? Oh my.
Arcius's voice dropped to an awe-filled whisper. It was Daemon, or rather the cage of glowing crimson vines that encircled his naked form. He was sitting cross-legged, hands on knees, palms facing to the heavens, and these vines wrapped around every limb, every finger even. The tips of them were inserted into Daemon's flesh. There was a wave of light that started from the roots where the vines came out of the ground that moved into Daemon's body. Julian could have sworn he saw that light wave move through Daemon's body. It was so alien a sight, but it was also beautiful. Julian wasn't sure how long he and Arcius watched this before speaking.
So, this is communing.
Julian breathed.
I thought he was simply going to pray or meditate. I did not know it would be this.
Arcius admitted, and the confessor seemed stunned and awed down to his bones. At that moment, Julian felt Daemon's mind reach for him. It was as if Julian too was being enmeshed in those vines of light. His eyelids fluttered shut as this sense of well-being flowed through him. The tension he hadn't known he'd carried washed away. "My fledgling, you were frightened and thought yourself alone." Daemon's voice rolled through his mind, filled with regret and tenderness. "Forgive me. I did not think you would wake before I came to get you."
It's okay. I'm fine.
Julian sent. "Oh, you are such a strong warrior, but I can see your heart. There is no shame in this. I missed you too, and in this strange new place I will need your company," Daemon assured him. And there was an accompanying mental caress. Julian let out a shivery sigh. The pleasure of being embraced and caressed like this could not fully be put into words. It made him feel stronger and weaker than ever before because it showed him himself.
You have it. I just don't want to burden you or Christian or anyone.
Julian admitted. "You are not a burden. You are a joy," Daemon said, and Julian swallowed hard. "But before we commune together, you must tell Arcius some news."
What is it?
Julian was curious. "We are being watched." Daemon told him about the 3 vampires he had seen. He especially described a beautiful black woman who had appeared to be in charge. Julian opened his eyes only to find Arcius glancing between himself and Daemon.
You were speaking to him?
Arcius asked. Julian nodded. He felt a little distanced from his body and the rest of the world. He was still enmeshed in the vampire king's mental embrace, but he had to tell Arcius this news. So he did. With every word, Arcius's awe was replaced by alarm. Finally, at the description of the beautiful black woman, his expression grew grim.
You know her?
Julian asked. Arcius nodded.
Stay with Daemon. I must go speak with Balthazar. The woman you saw is a powerful, influential confessor. If she knows about Daemon, then the preceptor Caemon Losis knows as well.
And that's not a good thing?
Julian guessed. Arcius looked grimmer still.
No, not at all.
Join us next time for episode 26, Iros.
If you don't think of yourself as that much of a reader, I understand. I don't think of myself as a typical author either. I'm a storyteller, and my only goal is to entertain you with exciting tales of romance and adventure, just like Everdark. I write what I like to read, and that's why you get hot heroes and badass villains, magical powers, fantasy worlds, and, of course, cliffhangers. It's a lot of fun for everyone, and I hope you decide to join in.
The Everdark podcast by Ex Aratare is performed by Edward Fox, Adam Riley, Jay Thillis, Bruno Devant, Kelly Michaels, and Hannah Hart, with Liz Gentle as Seer. Edited by Matthew Prince, continuity by Adrielle Wiggins. Everdark is produced by Wraith Rain Publishing in association with Her Grace Reed Studios. Copyright 2022 by Wraith Rain Publishing.